So we're going to be into Genesis a little bit more this week, but I want to give some background and context for Genesis 1 through 3. So it's probably the book of Genesis and also the other 5 books of what we call the Torah or the Pentateuch. You guys ever heard of the term Pentateuch? Yes. Okay, the first 5 books. Okay, they would call that the books of the law. So when Jesus says the law or the writings or the books of Moses, and he says, and the prophets, we kind of get in our mind what we think of that as. Oh, the law books are just Leviticus, maybe Numbers, Deuteronomy, and we go, oh, and the prophets, well, that's just all these Isaiah, major prophets, and you have little prophets, Obadiah, your minor prophets. Well, when he says the law and the prophets, what is he saying? The whole Old Testament. Just a way of saying from Genesis through all the prophets. Okay, Moses is writing all the way on. So we're going to talk about Genesis specifically today, because one thing we talked a little bit about last week was how obviously the Bible's made up of a lot of books. And you can have a book like Luke, and who's it written to? Do you remember? Theophilus. And then you can have another book that's written to, the Jews, or you can have one written to other Greeks. So there's lots of different tos and froms we need to make sure that we look at when we go through this, okay? So Genesis 1 through 3, we're going to talk about the background and context of this particular book today. So here's our questions to answer. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Specifically, who wrote Genesis 1 through 3? What's the author's background? So if it is Moses, where's he coming from? Because when I write from my perspective, my modern perspective, I might write, even now there's words that I hear my boys say, and I'm like, what is that word? It's new slang, and they say, hey, that thing over there, that's fire. I'm like, it means it's like burning? No, it's like we used to say that's cool. Now the new term is that's fire. See? So when I write and I put that's really cool, that's the opposite of fire. One's cold, one's hot. See how it changes over time? And so what's his background? When was the book written? When was Genesis written? In the beginning, right? Well, where was that? And we'll look at that a little bit because there's some discussion on when it was written. To whom was the book written? That one we might be able to answer. The Jews. Yeah, to the Israelites. Why was the book written? Might be another question. So when you go through Genesis, 1 through 11 is like creation, the fall, flood, that stuff. But what happens after you get to chapter 12? Who becomes the focus of Genesis? Abraham and his whole lineage. See, so you kind of have these 2 parts to the book. And so why was it written? What was he trying to do? So those are some questions we're going to answer. So, who wrote the book of Genesis? Let's just start there, okay? Because most people are going to say, if you ask them, is Moses, right? And that's the traditional view, the widely accepted. Most scholars are going to say, yeah, we think it was Moses, okay? We attribute it to Moses. So, he's historically and traditionally held as the author of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, okay? That's his stuff. Now, Joshua is the next one. Who wrote Joshua? Probably Joshua, okay? A lot of times they'll put a name on a book, but it wasn't actually that person who wrote it. That's just the main person in it, okay? So someone else could have recorded some things about that individual, okay? So we actually can find one indication in Numbers 33. Sometimes the Bible just tells us the answer. We don't have to go outside and try to find it. But here's a verse in Numbers 33. It says, these were the journeys of the Israelites who went out from the land of Egypt according to their divisions by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote down their movements according to their journeys on the command of Yahweh, and these are their journeys according to the movements. So this doesn't specifically, well, we probably should talk about what this says and what this doesn't say. Okay? What does it say Moses recorded? The journeys, okay? It does not say the origin of the universe and the earth. So you have to be careful you don't overread into it. At the same time, is it possible that it's referring to, Moses obviously wrote some stuff down. And he wrote down a history in the things that they were doing, probably from Sinai. Obviously, he was involved in the law, 10 Commandments. There's a lot of writing he did. It doesn't say Genesis, but that's what the Jews held. That's what the Israelites held, is that he did write Genesis. Okay? Traditionally, that's what they believe. Okay? He was their leader. He's the one who recorded it. I think there's good evidence to support he wrote it for a purpose, but it may be a little bit more complicated than he just went, Genesis, here you go. Okay, it's a little bit more involved than that, okay? So the Bible indicates that Moses was a contributor, if not the sole writer of the Pentateuch. We know he wrote some of it because it even told us right there in Numbers that he recorded their journeys. Okay? The book of Numbers confirms he wrote down the Israelites' travels. This would have been recorded probably in Exodus because that's where they're going. So that's the second book in the Pentateuch, probably penned by Moses. So the New Testament and Jesus actually uses this phrase, the book of Moses. What's he talking about when he says book of Moses? He's talking about the law. Okay, now you could be really detailed and say, well, if he says the book of Moses, he just means the books of the law, which would be which books? Maybe Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, maybe Deuteronomy, maybe throw Numbers in there since there's a lot of genealogy in that. But if you wanted to be super critical, you could say, well, the legal books are really Exodus, Leviticus, maybe some in Deuteronomy. Okay, Exodus, Leviticus. But how did they understand it? How did the Jews understand when they heard a phrase like the book of Moses? How would they have taken that? Would they have just taken those books?
No, I think they would have taken
They would have taken the Torah, the first 5 books. So that's why you have to stop and say, okay, Jesus seems to suggest Genesis was written by Moses because he includes, when he says the books of Moses, he knows what he's referring to, the first 5. And he calls it the book of Moses. So he's either using a phrase he was familiar with, knowing, I don't really care if Moses wrote Genesis or not, but that's what we know it as. Or actually Moses wrote it. Okay? That's why it's not as black and white sometimes as we want, but I think you can attribute it to Moses. You also see the phrase Moses and the prophets, the writings of Moses and the prophets. That's supposed to be the whole Old Testament combined. You have the writings of Moses, the Pentateuch, and then you had the prophets, everything outside of that. Some scholars believe Genesis was written by multiple individuals. Have you ever heard this before? Yeah, there's a view out there that believes that Genesis was not just one person named Moses writing the book. And I'll show you why. Okay, it's called the documentary hypothesis, is what this is called. It's called the JEPD. That's what the name of the group is that believes this. And they have gone through the books of Genesis and some of other books of the Torah, and because of the names of God changing, you have people call him Yahweh, and then in other places you have him called Elohim, and then there's priestly indications in there, and then you have some stuff from Deuteronomy. So you actually they break it into 4 authors based on writing style. Doesn't mean that Moses couldn't have switched the language he was using, so it's not just this open and shut case. But there's indications because of just different writing styles, different word usages, that they say, no, we actually have 4 authors in the book of Genesis. This is, again, based on literary styles, word usages, suggests that the book wasn't completed until the time following the Babylonian exile. So this group is going to say, no, it was done a lot later than what we think. And this is one of the sticking points with this view, is the traditional view is going to say, no, it was written well before the exile was even initiated. This group comes out and says, no, we think that there's these 4 scribal hands that ultimately brought it to a completed form, and that was during or after the exile in Babylon. Okay, just the different thoughts. I'll show you reasons why they come to these conclusions as we go through some of this. Okay. So some scholars believe Genesis was written by Moses, but may have had some editorial updates. So is it possible there was some editing done? Like Moses wrote it, and then he handed it on, and then they're like, we might want to adjust this for clarity's sake, update this for, if you needed to update a location or a people's to match understanding, like what about that place over there? It used to be owned by these guys, now it's owned by these guys, and your new readers are going, where is that? Like, who is that? And you go, well, let's update it. Yeah. Sometimes you'll find this throughout the Bible, that there's indications where it'll say things like Israel and Judah, but that means they were split, because remember, it was just the kingdom of Israel before they had the split after Solomon, right? And it's before the time of Solomon, that might be said. So how did the person know about the split? And most people say, well, it was divine revelation. Could be. Or it's possible you just have an editorial hand that said, I'm writing this and I need to update this, or this needs to be written in a way that people understand based on the current conditions, which is that there's 2 kingdoms because we're split. but I'm recording stuff from before that. So it's not a bad thing that before, as this is being inspired and God is working amongst the people here, he's crafting a book as we get it to a completed state. And it's okay if there's people that, I think it's okay that there was editors to fix like a date or a location. They're not changing doctrines. They're not saying, oh yeah, God created, now God did not create. They're just trying to keep it so people can understand it as they've gone through the process, okay, as it kind of gets to that final point where we get it. Okay, like Moses' death might be an example of this. Where is that recorded in Scripture? Let's see if I have the actual verse. I do. There it is. It's in Deuteronomy. Who wrote Deuteronomy based on what we just talked about? Moses. So did Moses record his own death?
No.
And then talk about what happened after he died?
It would have to be Joshua.
See, but this is where it gets kind of like, well, but the first 5 are attributed to Moses. And Moses recorded some things in Deuteronomy, if he wrote it, that how would he have known unless either God gave him that? And I've seen people that will say, well, God gave him in advance the details of his death and what would happen afterwards. Because they can't let go of this concept that Moses wrote the first 5 books. But I don't think it has to be quite that, strict. It's okay if someone came in and said, I'm going to add a little bit on here that Moses wrote Deuteronomy, but we're going to record this part about him, things that he did. There's also changes in the language. Like when you're writing a book or you're writing a letter to somebody, how do you refer to yourself? I went and did this, and I was glad to have seen you at the. But do you say your first name when you're writing? No, not typically. And so what's that an indicator of when it's third person versus first? Someone else is writing. And you see that. How many times do you read in the Torah, Moses went and did this, Moses went down? Could be him. Could be somebody that's recording for him, as he's talking. There's all these things that could happen. But in Deuteronomy 34 it says, then Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in the land of Moab, according to the command of Yahweh. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But until this day, no one knows his burial site. Apparently Moses doesn't even know his own burial site based on this verse if he wrote it. No one knows, including Moses. All right, so see how this creates these situations where you have to go, okay, who really wrote Deuteronomy 34? So you could make the case Joshua would be the most likely example or the most likely author, but now you have to expand the law of Moses in the first 5 books to not be so focused on Moses and Moses alone. See, we can generally say that, but if we're getting into the very details here, who wrote this? Wasn't necessarily Moses. Okay, so this can apply to other places. This is where scholars, when they're reading this stuff, they go, well, what about Genesis and some of these other places? Is there a hand that may have had something to do with some of this that doesn't violate inspiration or scripture, but had some experience or wrote because they were led or Moses had instructed them to, or different things? Okay. So here's the bottom line. It is reasonable to believe Moses wrote Genesis. Okay. There's no reason to say he didn't. There's no evidence to say definitively he did not. Okay, it's okay, this is the majority view, is that he is going to be the author. But it's also reasonable to believe it may have been written or edited by Joshua or others before the time of its ultimate completion. From what we just saw, you could have other people that came in here that were authorized to say, I want to record this thing that happened. And it wasn't Moses with his pen writing it. And it was still okay. It still got into the book. Okay? Regardless, it's still an inspired book and attributed as God's word by Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus refers to the whole Old Testament as the law of Moses or the books of Moses and the prophets, and he looks at it from beginning to end, Scripture. Okay? So that's probably the most important piece, is where did Jesus hold these books? Regardless of who wrote them, they were Scripture. Okay? Most important. So let's talk about the dating of Genesis. So if it was written by Moses, which is probably the majority view, he was born in Egypt in 1525 BC. He lived to be 120 years old. We know that from Deuteronomy 34:7. So all your math people, how old was Moses? Don't go up, go down, because we're in BCs, remember. 1405. It would have been, he would have had to have his writing done by the time he died. So the latest we can put that if he in fact wrote the book of Genesis, it had to be done by 1405 BC, because that's when he's gone. Okay? So if you're in this Moses camp solely, these are the dates that you got to put Genesis. Moses was not alive at the time of Genesis. Agreed? So how do we process that? This is kind of the point of our study, is Genesis 1 through 3, and these are events before Moses existed. So how did he get the information? Where did he get this stuff from? You know, one thing that's kind of funny is in the time when they were starting to write things down, like Torah, and they were starting to write a lot more, you had these Jewish scholars and theologians that were, I would call them the old school guys, okay? They grew up on oral traditions. And so how did they learn everything? Memorized it. They were told this by someone before them, and they had to put it in here. And why was that so important?
So they can pass it down to future.
Yeah, and so you didn't have to be like, what was that story? Go sift through your papers. I've got it. Here. They didn't have that even a lot of times. Papyrus was a rare thing. You know, having something to write on that lasted was not just you go down to the store and buy a pack, right? So you had to have that oral tradition. So as time went forward and writing became more widely known, guess what these old school scholars struggled with? Writing. We shouldn't be writing this stuff down. And we go, that's crazy. It's crazy. But why did they say that? Because they thought it was laziness. You don't put it here where you can pull it just like that when you need it. You're putting it in a book so that now it's not up here all the time. That's a shortcut. You don't have to do the work. Think about what we do today.
Same thing with speed dial.
Exactly. Or we got tablets and we got our phones and we don't have to look anything. We don't have to put it here. We don't even have to write it down anymore, do we? And how many people, we just Google. And how many of us, maybe some of us older people, we look at our kids and we go, you know, when I was a kid, we had to write that down and open a book. And we just reject a lot of that because we're so caught up in here. Well, guess what? They had the same thing with the oral traditions. So you can see how as time has gone on, even the traditions that were passed down were written, oral, but writing was tough. You didn't have a lot of paper that was just abundant like we have today. And so you had to memorize stuff and you had to pass it on. And it might have been Moses who said, I've got all this stuff, and these people that have all this stuff, it's time to make a record of this. And he wrote it down. Okay? And so that explains why he was able to write maybe on Genesis 1 and stuff before it ever got to him, because this was passed down for generations, whether it's through oral tradition or writing, to the people, and then they were able to compile it. And he said, let's put this all together. So this means Moses recorded earlier oral traditions. You could maybe say they were written. The consensus is that they were oral traditions passed on because of the lack of availability of writing utensils and paper. You had to be able to do it. So obviously, if Genesis is Moses' writing, we know it records events way before Moses. And so you can say, well, he probably got some of this passed to him, or it was divinely given. When he goes up on the mountain, God says, I'm going to tell you what happened. Okay? But Moses still had to write it down. You know, how does God explain something from a time when there was no human beings? How does Moses has to put that information in his brain? He has to take it to a pen and take it to a piece of paper and say, how do I explain this? How do I write this in a way that's understandable? So let's look at Moses for a minute. We'll just look at his background. He was born to a Hebrew woman. Did you know that? So he's born Hebrew. What's the story of how that all went down? Remember? They're going to kill. Yeah, they're going to kill all the boys. Put him in a basket. Yeah, he's found by the princess. Okay.
The king's daughter.
Yep. So he was raised by an Egyptian princess. So Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, finds him in the reeds and says, oh, one of the Hebrews' babies. She had compassion on him. And she said, I'm going to take him into my house. And so she finds his mom. Basically, until he's weaned, he's with his Hebrew mother. And then he ends up coming and living in the palace. Exodus 2. The daughter of Pharaoh said, take this boy and nurse him for me, and I myself will give you wages. And the woman took the boy and she nursed him. And the boy grew, and she brought him to the daughter of Pharaoh, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him out from the water. So his name Moses, what does it mean? Drawn out of the water. Okay. He's named by his Egyptian mom. It wasn't his Hebrew mom who named him, it was his Egyptian mom. Did the Egyptian mothers use Hebrew terms? What would they have used? What kind of language and terminology would they have used? Egyptian. Okay, it was Egyptian. Like you think of hieroglyphics and those types of things. They had their own language. Now, he may have actually originally had a longer name. Have you ever heard this before? And it's because his mom that raised him is Egyptian. She's not Hebrew. And so when you look at Egyptian naming, they would name their children with deity names or important figures of the religious cult of Egypt. Okay? So Moses may have actually originally been Amos, which means one born of the moon god. Doesn't really make a lot of sense except you see Mose in there. Okay? It's probably more likely he was Hatmos or Iramos, which means born of the Nile. Because the Nile was a deity in their mind. And when she draws him out of the waters of the Nile, what is she thinking? Like, oh, look what the Nile has given me. And that's why she has compassion. That's why she has a religious mindset, a supernatural worldview. So she takes him in and says, the Nile produced a child for me. And she probably called him one drawn out of the Nile, one born of the Nile. But if you don't want to keep your Egyptian religious connection, what do you do with your name? You drop the connections with Egyptian religion and you just say, one drawn out of the water. See how it could have gone from this to Moses? Now, why did Moses do that when this is being recorded? And he kind of puts the language in there so people will know I'm not connected to an Egyptian god. I don't want that over my head. I'm Moses, and so he writes it down. See how that kind of could transpire into this as you're going into a Hebrew text that's written to Hebrews, to Israelites, okay? Moses would have experienced formal Egyptian education. So he's not just a layperson in Egypt. He's in the royal household with a princess of Pharaoh, his daughter. And so they were well-trained, well-taught, well-educated. Okay? You've probably seen Charlton Heston, I was thinking of the Ten Commandments, and he's, there and he's looking at the thing with the Pharaoh, and they're, making some architectural decisions and different stuff. But they were trained specifically in religion. I mean, you think about, I'm going to show you some stuff, but Egypt was not a secular country. It was supernatural worldview everywhere. Everywhere. So you don't think Moses got taught Egyptian religion? He absolutely got taught Egyptian religion. That means that they had stories of how everything came to be in Egypt. Did you realize that? They have their own origin stories. And did Moses know these? You bet he did. He was taught all this stuff. I'm going to show it to you in a second, but this is what he was taught. Some in Egypt were even trained in Canaanite languages, because remember, Egypt's huge. They're all over. They owned Palestine area for a long time. And he might have learned some of these ancient Canaanite languages so that he could be effective in interacting, recording, writing, sending messages. Isn't it interesting how God takes a person and through their life brings them up through all the circumstances they need to get all the information they need so that then when they become the thing and they're called, God can say, you're ready to go. I've given you all the training that you need to do that. You see that with David. How did he learn how to throw rocks? Protecting his flock. How did Moses learn this stuff? God knows exactly what they need and gets them in the circumstances so that they're well trained to be able to walk back into a place like Egypt and say, let the people go. And here's a plague on this. Here's a plague on that. Okay? That was all part of the plan. He would have learned archery and horseback riding. The Pharaoh that was in charge at the time of all of this, as he was being raised and growing, was really into archery and horseback riding. That was what the people would do in their spare time, as they would go out and participate in this. So he might have been a really good archer. Who knows? Yeah. At the age of 40, he decided to embrace his Hebrew heritage. This is where he ends up having compassion on the Hebrews. He kills the slave master, and he escapes to Midian. So he's 40 years old at this point. So if he's with his mom till 5, and then goes into the Egyptian royal training, how many years is he in Egyptian culture being taught? 35 years. That's a long time to be studying and learning Egyptian culture. So let's talk about some ancient origin stories. Now that you kind of know a little bit about Moses, okay, I want you to keep in mind his background. And then let's look at some of these. We're going to have to take a couple weeks and do these. We're going to do Egyptian, one of the Egyptian ones, but we're going to look at Sumerian and Babylonian here in the next couple weeks because they're really important when we look at Genesis 1. Okay. So here's the ancient Near East. But you can see you got Egypt down here, right? This is where we've been focused today. And you can see where Israel's at in Jerusalem. Damascus, where's that now? What country is that? Syria, okay? So that's Syria. And then you have over there, you have the Babylonians. You can see where you had Nineveh, where the Persians and the Assyrians were. And you have this area over there. So if we were to say ancient Mesopotamia, where am I talking at? It's basically over there between the Tigris and the Euphrates. So when they say Mesopotamian civilizations, that's where you're at. Babylon, some of those. Okay, so we're going to have to look at some Mesopotamian religion. Okay, so when I say Mesopotamia, I want you to just think of that area. Okay, not necessarily just one place. Okay, but you can see their surroundings. So you have north, you've got a country, east, west. You've got these different groups that are right around Egypt or right around Israel that definitely had influence on them. Would you agree? I mean, you can read later on in the story, they got into some big trouble because they started embracing some of these countries around them, okay? So I'm going to call the Sumerians. So who are the Sumerians? I didn't really mention that in the picture, but where are we talking about? This is the southern Near East. So basically, they were a bunch of city-states and places with their own kings that were basically kind of Fertile Crescent area right there by the rivers and then south. Okay, and this was way before, this is like the earliest civilizations out there. Okay, they were not united in one country we call Sumeria. That's actually a different term. Okay, these guys were a bunch of city-states. They have this thing called the Sumerian Kings List. It actually records all the kings at the time that were of all these different city-states. Okay, so if I say the Sumerians, we're talking about ancient area that influenced a lot of these other countries. Okay, this is kind of before the big ones. In fact, if you look at the dates, look when they started. 4100 BC, earliest of civilizations we have found. Okay? The Egyptians started about 4000 BC. Is there some overlap? Oh yeah, definitely some overlap. Okay. The Babylonians are about 2000 BC. Is there some overlap? See how they all overlap a little bit? You've got some time where the Egyptians are still very, very prominent, but now the Babylonians are prominent. Okay. Syria, or I'm going to call it Ugarit or Ugaritic. Okay, that's why am I focusing on this one tiny place to the north in Syria called Ugarit? Because that is the closest language we have in the ancient world to ancient Hebrew. So when our Bible translators and they're trying to figure out a word, guess where they go? Does Ugaritic have any words like this that help us understand this word in Hebrew? Because they're both ancient Semitic languages, and Ugaritic's as close as you're going to get. So that's why it's important to know what their religion was, right? Plus, if you think about it, what happened when the split took place in Israel? You have the northern kingdom, southern kingdom. Jeroboam goes up and he says, I'm the king of the north now, but where's the temple at?
In the south.
In the south. I don't want people going here. So what does he do?
Build a temple.
And what does it look like? It's a bull. And he creates the altars up there. And you know what they look like? The religion to the north in Ugaritic. So they had already started to bring in Ugaritic in northern religious, practices, influence. And so it's like, well, you can worship Yahweh up here, we'll just make a bull. But that's what Baal looked like. So see how you could start to see where these things started to meld together in the north. And ultimately they get destroyed by the Assyrians first. Right? So that's why what does Ugaritic say? What's their story? Okay. Each of these civilizations had a creation story. Can you believe it? They all had to explain where things came from. They were all doing their best. Okay. So you have Mesopotamian accounts, that whole area where Babylon is, and kind of the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Okay. You have Babylonian, Sumerian creation accounts. We're going to look at some of those. And then you have Egyptian accounts. Did you know the Egyptians had an origin story account? Yeah. Then you have a Ugaritic account. So those are going to be some things we're going to look at. And you're going to see some touch points with Genesis as we go through these. So here's Genesis 1 through 3. This is where we're going to start, right at the beginning. Okay, I want you to just have this fresh in your mind so you can see what Moses is writing. And then we're going to look at some of these other things that are said. So here it is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. A couple times. So let's see how this one looks if you take and you go, okay, ancient Egyptians, how did they understand this story in their world? Okay? Because there's definitely some touch points with the Israelites and Moses. Would you agree? So let's look at it. So the Israelites spent 400 years in Egyptian culture. You think that they became accustomed to knowing what they believed? You know, when we're shutting down for the day because we're going to go sacrifice to Ra or have a festival to Ra, they knew what that was about. Okay? They didn't agree with it, but they knew about it. The Exodus leader Moses was obviously educated and trained as the Egyptian prince. He knew about this stuff. May have actually even influenced the way he constructed Genesis if he wrote it. Doesn't mean that he's saying I got to make sure I fit Egyptian into this, but he's still thinking how he's been trained, and he wrote accordingly. Okay? I'm going to show you that in a second. The Exodus was actually a war between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, if you remember. We did a whole study on that some weeks ago, of every plague is targeting a god of Egypt.
Right.
And Moses would have been a great person for that, wouldn't he?
Why not?
They had 3, depending on which city was the capital, they might change the story a hair to kind of appease their patron god of the city. Here's the creation story if you're an ancient Egyptian. This is what Moses would have been taught. Okay? The god Atum emerges from a primordial water called Nun. So he's already exists, and what happens? He decides it's time to go do something. And so he comes out of this primordial water and says, I'm going to do creation. Now they believe obviously that what's there before the creation starts? The primordial water. And there's this self-existent God. He wasn't created by anyone. Created himself, I guess you could say, is what they would say. And he decides, I'm going to come out of this stuff and I'm going to do some things. Okay? Nun is actually described in Egyptian creation epics as a chaotic sea. Why is the chaotic piece important?
Troubled waters.
Troubled. And what's the deity going to do with the chaos? Tame it. Order. We cannot have chaos. We have to have order. Now, what was Pharaoh's job as Pharaoh? Yes. Yeah. They even had a specific word in ancient Egyptian that he had to keep this. It was order. If there's chaos, you're not doing your job. And why is that? Because you reflect the deity. And so order, not chaos. So an ancient Egyptian was not going to come in and say, what was the materials that were there? What were they made of? Molecules of water? They're going to say there was this primordial sea and the god Atum came out of it and decided to create. Bring order to the chaotic sea. Okay? Just keep this in mind. So he rises from none and orders the chaos. He manifests himself as the sun god. You ever heard of Ra? That's him. This is the one who does this. Okay? He travels across the sky daily to take a look at all of his creation. Then he goes to sleep. And then he repeats the cycle the next day. Okay? This is how they account for the sun and the dark and morning and all these things. He's a falcon-headed deity of light, the sun, and day. So I'll show you a picture here. This is where they would have said Ra or Atum by the other, or Atum Ra, if you've ever heard that phrase. That's him. Okay, so this is the guy who does the creating. Okay. So in this instance, he actually spits and creates this thing called the Enid. Okay. And this is the 9 chief deities of ancient Egypt. Okay? That's what he does. So here's the first one. Shu is the first one he creates with his spit, okay, or his breath, right? And this is the god of the dry air. Then he also has Tefnut, the moist air. So the first thing he creates is dry air, moist air. So these two are brother and sister created from the deity, but they get married and then they have kids because that's what happens in ancient Egypt. Okay, and they create Geb, who is the earth, and Nut or Nut, who's the sky. And then these two get together, and they have 4 kids. Osiris, Isis or Isis, Nephthys, and Seth. And these are the beginning of the 9 of the Ennead, the 9 divine. Now, we're missing one. You know who we're missing? It's kind of a famous one. Starts with an H. Horus. Who said it? Good job, John. So Osiris and Isis or Isis create Horus. Now, why is Horus important? He's the 9th one, but he is the connection to the kingship. In fact, they believed the Pharaoh was Horus incarnate. So see how the trail goes back? He's part of the 9. Okay? So Horus was the link between deity and human kingship. That's where Horus fits. Now, because he's believed to be the God incarnate, he was viewed as a god, as a deity. So when Moses shows up and says, let the people go, and then starts wrecking these gods, what does that do to Pharaoh's credibility as a deity? He's not doing his job. He's starting to lose influence with people. There's going to be a lot of problems, theologically in Egypt when this starts happening. Horus was believed to be the son of God, the heir to the throne, the king of the earth. Isn't it ironic that Yahweh might take offense to something like this when there's a son of the deity on the throne in Egypt who thinks he has ultimate control and he just goes in and embarrasses him? Maybe he took it a little personal, So the reason that I share this with you is obviously there's more than just these plagues to say if really bad stuff happens, so let them go. These are supernatural theological things that Moses was doing when he went to Egypt because he's trying to show them Yahweh is God, not Atum Ra. But it had to be done over a process. And also these other deities. I have to embarrass them. Atum's creation process began with him emerging from primordial waters on a mound. So the idea is it's all water, and then there's this mound of earth that comes out of the waters, and there he is, doing his work. Okay? This was known as, instead they call it in the beginning, they called it the first time. So it's basically the first time he decided to do this thing that he did with the earth. This is what happened. That's what they would call it. You've seen this? Where do you think the image for the pyramid came from? Where do you think they got that? It's just like these pyramids. It's the mound. That's the basis for the pyramid, is the mound of Atum Ra coming out of the primordial waters and being on a mound. This is what it was. All of their stuff looks like this, even the Sphinx's head. It's a mound. It's because they're going back to their origin story, their main god, Atum Ra, and what he did. And so what are we going to do? We're going to reflect that in all of our architecture and our creation and the stuff we build. So the kids would know. When you looked at this, what would you think of if you were an Egyptian kid?
That's Ra.
Yeah, Ra came out of the mound and the primordial waters and created. And that's why we have the pyramids. And these were where they put their kings in the mound, Here's some other architecture from the valleys of Egypt. You can see they all kind of have this mound look. They kind of slope up, don't they? Like a hill. And that's because they're trying to replicate Atum Ra coming out of the primordial waters. It's a reflection. In fact, you see this? This is a temple in ancient Egypt. So you can't really tell. You can tell in this picture really well, but if you went there, you wouldn't be actually to tell there was much of a slope. But even their temples, when you'd walk in the front doors, there's a slight gradual incline. Because what are you doing when you go in? You're going up the mound. And where's the deity? On the top of the mound. And so that's why you have this slanted look up, because it's remembering Atum Ra's creation out of the primordial waters and coming up into creating this mountain. So I tried to draw a picture over here in a second. I'm going to show you. But you notice here in Genesis 1, 9 through 10, it says, and God said, let the waters under heaven be gathered to one place. So what did he say about the waters under heaven? What are they supposed to do?
Gathered in
One place. And let the dry ground appear. And it was so. So how do you have the dry ground and the waters gathered into one place at the same time? How does that look? Yeah. God called the dry ground earth, and he called the collection of the waters that are gathered in one place. What are they called? Seas. So how do you have water gathered in one place, but you still have seas? I'll show you a picture. See, you can have a land mass, and then you can have waters that are all together, but you could say if you're on this side, that's this sea. We do that now. This sea, this sea, this sea. So this was kind of the simplest my artistic ability to create this idea of how they would have understood this. Creation, boom, there's the mound, the waters are here, and Moses uses some language that kind of suggests a similar thing. It's just different. Because who created? Atum Ra? No. He says Elohim, God, Yahweh. And to Ebner 2 sons were born. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and the name of his brother was Joktan. Now this question is, earth divided, what do you mean? This is right at the beginning of Genesis. And so this suggests that there may have been that one giant continent, one landmass. Oh, they call it Pangaea or something, I think is what they taught. And then when you had the flood and other things happened, it split and was separated. That may be what happened. That may be how the Egyptians understood it. Moses probably writing from that understanding as well. And these are not scientific people. These are not scientific people. These are spiritually minded, supernatural thinking. How did the earth come to be? This is how it came to be. There's this thing called the Egyptian Papyrus Insinger. Okay, this is basically like a psalm almost the ancient Egyptians had that recorded the creation story. I want to show you a couple things about it. Here's what it says. He created the light and darkness in which is every creature. That's how it begins. How does Genesis begin? And what does he create? It's the first thing. Light. Light. Okay. Here's another one. He created the earth, begetting millions, swallowing them up and begetting again. Kind of interesting. You get a little further in. Now I'm going in order through Genesis. Let the waters under the heaven be gathered into one place. Let the dry ground appear. He calls the dry ground earth. He calls the collection of waters seas. He created day, month, and year through the commands of the Lord of command. He created summer and winter through the rising and setting of Sothis. He created constellation of those what are in the sky so that those on earth should learn them. And what does Moses write in verses 14? God said, let the lights be in the vaulted dome of heaven to separate day from night, and let there be signs and for appointed times. And for days and years they shall be as lights in the vaulted dome of heaven to give light to the earth. And it was so, and God made 2 great lights, the great light to rule and the smaller light to rule the night and the stars. This matches chronologically how Moses is writing Genesis. And so what I'm trying to give you a flavor of is that Moses is doing what he would do if you arrived building a house in another country. He knows these things, and he's writing them to give people the truth, but he's still using his training. Yeah. And he's also countering Egyptian religion at the same time. He created the breath in the egg that there is no access to it. Notice his language. So God created humankind in his image. In the likeness of God he created him, male and female he created them. God formed the man of dust from the ground. And what did he do? Blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. See, so that the Egyptians had a similar story about that. They just worded it very different. God created the heavens and the earth. And so Yahweh is God. That's what I would say if I were to sum it up. Not Egyptian gods.